White Chick stands as one of the most memorable comedy films of the early 2000 era, a movie that blended broad slapstick humor with sharp social satire in a way that few Hollywood comedies had attempted before. Released in the summer of 2004, this film was produced in the United States and was the product of Revolution Studios in collaboration with Wayans Brothers Entertainment, with distribution handled by Columbia Pictures. The film was directed by Keenen Ivory Wayans, a filmmaker and comedian who had already built a reputation for pushing boundaries in comedic storytelling through his earlier work on shows and films that mixed parody with cultural commentary. The screenplay itself was a family affair, written collaboratively by Keenen Ivory Wayans alongside his brothers Sean Wayans and Marlon Wayans, along with contributions from Michael Anthony Snowden and Xavier Cook, which gave the script a distinctly personal and layered comedic voice since the writers were also the lead performers bringing their own material to life on screen. From its very inception, the movie was designed as a vehicle to showcase the physical comedy and improvisational talents of the Wayans brothers, who had already gained fame through their sketch comedy background and previous film work, and White Chicks became one of the boldest expressions of that comedic sensibility. Wrapped in an outrageous premise that would go on to become a cult classic despite receiving a mixed reception from critics upon release. The overview of White Chicks centers on two FBI agents named Kevin Copeland and Marcus Copeland, brothers who are constantly finding themselves in trouble with their superiors due to their unconventional and often disastrous approach to fieldwork. After a botched drug bust that becomes a public relations nightmare for the Bureau, the two agents are given what appears to be a simple and low-stakes assignment as a form of punishment duty, which is to escort two wealthy socialite sisters, Heather and Tiffany Wilson, to a resort in the Hamptons and ensure they arrive safely for a high-profile weekend event. The Wilson sisters are known for being vain, spoiled, and somewhat vacuous figures within New York high society, and the assignment seems beneath the skill set of two trained federal agents. However, everything changes when the sisters are involved in a minor car accident on the way to the airport, leaving both of them with facial scrapes and bruises that make them unwilling to appear in public looking anything less than perfect. Faced with the possibility of failing yet another assignment, and being fired from the Bureau altogether, Kevin and Marcus make the audacious decision to disguise themselves as the two socialites using elaborate prosthetic makeup, wigs, and padded costumes, essentially transforming themselves into white women in order to complete the mission undetected. As the plot unfolds, the two brothers find themselves thrust into the extravagant and unfamiliar world of the Hamptons elite, where they must navigate high society parties, fashion shows, and social rivalries, all while maintaining their disguises and trying to uncover a kidnapping plot that they discover is targeting the real Wilson sisters. The humor of the film largely stems from the fish-out-of-water scenario as the two agents, disguised as pampered white socialites, struggle to blend into a world of privilege, wealth, and superficiality that is entirely foreign to their own experiences and backgrounds. Along the way, the disguised brothers become entangled in various romantic subplots, awkward social situations, and comedic set pieces that test their ability to maintain the ruse, including moments where they must dance, model, and interact with an ensemble of shallow socialite characters who never suspect that the two women they are speaking with are actually two black FBI agents in disguise. As the story progresses, the stakes rise when the kidnapping plot becomes clearer, and Kevin and Marcus must balance solving the case, protecting the people around them, and keeping their true identities hidden until the situation reaches its inevitable comedic and dramatic climax, culminating in the unmasking of the true criminals behind the kidnapping scheme and the restoration of order. All while the brothers manage to salvage both their careers and their unexpected personal connections made during their time undercover. The cast of White Chicks is anchored by Sean Wayans in the role of Marcus Copeland and Marlon Wayans in the role of Kevin Copeland, both of whom also transform into the characters of Tiffany and Heather Wilson respectively for the majority of the film runtime. Supporting the brothers are performances from Jamie King and Ann Dudek, who portray the real Heather and Tiffany Wilson at the beginning of the story before the switch takes place. The film also features Frankie Faison as Jack Fleming, the frustrated FBI supervisor of the two lead agents, along with Terry Crews delivering a memorable comedic performance as Latrell Spencer, a wealthy and aggressive suitor who becomes infatuated with one of the disguised brothers, creating some of the most talked about comedic moments in the entire film. Other notable cast members include Maitland Ward, Busy Phillips, Jennifer Carpenter, John Hurd, and Lachlan Monroe, each contributing to the ensemble of socialite characters and side plots that fill out the world of the Hamptons setting. The chemistry between the cast, particularly the interplay between the Wayans brothers and Terry Crews, became one of the defining elements that helped the film build a lasting fanbase over the years since its release. White Chicks was officially released in theaters on June 23, 2004, arriving during the crowded summer movie season where it competed against several other major studio releases for audience attention. Despite a production budget of approximately $37 million, the film went on to gross over $113 million worldwide, making it a commercial success even though critical reviews at the time were largely unfavorable, with many critics dismissing the premise as gimmicky or questioning the comedic value of the makeup transformation concept. However, audience reception told a different story, as the film found a strong and devoted following particularly among younger viewers and fans of physical comedy, and over the years it has been re-evaluated by many as a genuinely funny and quotable cult classic that holds up as one of the more inventive comedic premises of its era. The trailer for the film, which was released ahead of its theatrical debut, heavily emphasized the transformation sequence and the culture clash humor, giving audiences a clear preview of the outrageous disguises and slapstick set pieces that would define the film experience, and this marketing approach successfully built curiosity and anticipation that translated into strong opening weekend numbers. In the years since its release, White Chicks has become something of a comfort watch and quotable favorite for many fans of early 2000s comedy, often remembered for its bold premise, its willingness to lean fully into absurdity, and the surprising heart found in the brotherly bond between the two lead characters as they navigate an unfamiliar world together. The film's legacy has grown through home video releases, television syndication, and a strong presence across social media where clips and quotes from the film continue to circulate and introduce the movie to new generations of viewers who were not even born when it originally hit theaters. Whether viewed as a straightforward comedy or as a clever piece of social satire poking fun at class and privilege, White Chicks remains a distinctive entry in the Wayans family filmography and a film that continues to spark conversation about its themes, its humor, and its lasting cultural impact nearly 2 decades after its original release. White Chicks continues to hold a special place in the landscape of 2000s comedy, and beyond its plot there is an enormous amount to explore when it comes to the characters, the craft behind the film, and the cultural footprint it has left behind, all of which makes for a rich and rewarding deep dive for anyone revisiting this movie today. At the heart of the film are Kevin and Marcus Copeland, two brothers whose relationship forms the emotional backbone beneath all the outrageous comedy surrounding them. What makes their dynamic so compelling is the contrast in their personalities even before the disguise plot begins, with one brother often being portrayed as more impulsive and reckless in his approach to fieldwork, while the other tends to be the voice of caution, constantly trying to rein in his siblings' more chaotic instincts. This kind of brotherly push and pull is a classic device in buddy comedy storytelling, but the Wayans brothers bring an authenticity to it that comes from their real-life sibling relationship, and that lived-in chemistry translates into a believable bond on screen that elevates even the most absurd moments of the film. Their arc throughout the story follows a familiar but effective shape, beginning with two agents who are seen as failures or embarrassments within their own department, then forcing them into a situation so far outside their comfort zone that it strips away their professional armor entirely, and finally allowing them to rediscover their competence and value not despite the ridiculous disguise but almost because of it. Since the skills of observation, adaptability, and quick thinking that make them good federal agents are the very same skills that allow them to survive undercover in a world of Hampton's high society. Beyond the central brotherly relationship, the film functions as a satire of wealth and class, and this angle deserves much closer examination than it often receives in casual conversations about the movie. The Hamptons setting is deliberately chosen as a symbol of old money exclusivity, a world defined by garden parties, extravagant fashion shows, and a social hierarchy built almost entirely on appearance and reputation rather than substance. By dropping two working-class black FBI agents into this environment disguised as wealthy white socialites, the film creates a satirical lens that exposes just how much of high society behavior is performance in the first place. The socialites that Kevin and Marcus interact with are often portrayed as shallow, image-obsessed, and disconnected from any kind of genuine human connection, which serves to highlight the emptiness beneath the glamour of that world. In a strange way, the two disguised agents end up being more emotionally honest and perceptive than the people around them who have spent their entire lives immersed in that culture, and this inversion is where much of the film's sharper commentary lives, tucked beneath the surface of what many viewers initially dismiss as pure slapstick. The film essentially argues that identity, especially within elite social circles, is often a costume already, and the literal disguise worn by the brothers becomes a heightened version of the metaphorical disguises that many of the socialite characters wear every single day. The comedic technique on display throughout the film is also worth breaking down in detail, since it draws from a very specific lineage of American sketch comedy that the Wayans family helped popularize through their earlier television work. The humor leans heavily on physical comedy, exaggerated reactions, and a willingness to commit fully to bits that other filmmakers might have pulled back on, and this fearless commitment is part of what has allowed the film to endure as a quotable favorite years after release. Scenes built around dance sequences, awkward romantic tension, and moments of nearly getting caught rely on perfect comedic timing from the two lead performers, who spend the majority of the film acting through heavy prosthetics and makeup, which is no small feat considering how much of comedic performance typically depends on facial expression and physical nuance. The fact that both performers manage to convey humor, panic, charm, and frustration convincingly while buried under layers of makeup design speaks to a level of comedic skill that is often underappreciated when critics discuss the film purely on the basis of its premise. There is also a strong improvisational energy running through many of the film's scenes, a hallmark of the Wayans family's comedic approach that traces back to their sketch television roots, giving certain interactions a loose and spontaneous feeling that adds to the sense of chaotic fun defining the film's tone from start to finish. No discussion of the film's comedic legacy would be complete without addressing Terry Crews's performance as Latrell Spencer, a character who has taken on a life far beyond the film itself in the years since its release. Latrell's larger-than-life personality, his over-the-top physicality, and his now iconic dance sequence set to a popular song of that era have become one of the most referenced and reshared moments from the entire movie across social media platforms. What makes this performance so effective is the total commitment Terry Crews brings to a character who could have easily felt like a one-note joke, yet instead becomes memorable precisely because of the fearless energy and charisma poured into every single scene he appears in. This performance helped launch a broader recognition of Terry Crews as a comedic talent capable of stealing scenes even in an ensemble filled with strong performers, and it foreshadowed the kind of larger-than-life comedic roles he would go on to take in future projects. The cultural staying power of this particular character and his most famous scene demonstrates how a single standout performance within a broader ensemble comedy can end up defining much of how a film is remembered by audiences long after its initial theatrical run has ended. Turning to the production and reception side of the story, it is worth expanding on how the film performed both critically and commercially, since the gap between those two reactions tells an interesting story about audience taste versus critical expectation at the time. Critics reviewing the film upon its release were often skeptical of the central premise, viewing the makeup transformation concept as a gimmick that could not sustain an entire feature-length runtime, and many reviews focused on the perceived thinness of the plot rather than engaging with the satire or the comedic performances happening within it. Audiences, however, responded very differently, embracing the film's willingness to be unapologetically silly while still finding genuine laughs in its most outrageous set pieces. And this disconnect between critical reception and audience enjoyment is a pattern that has repeated itself with several cult comedy classics over the decades. Word of mouth and repeat viewings, particularly among younger audiences and fans of physical comedy, helped the film build box office momentum that exceeded its production budget significantly, proving that critical consensus does not always predict which films will find lasting cultural relevance. Over time, as the film moved from theatrical release into heavy rotation on cable television and later into constant circulation through streaming platforms and social media clips, its reputation shifted considerably, with many former skeptics coming to appreciate the boldness of its comedic swings and the surprising amount of heart woven into its central brotherly relationship. The lasting cultural impact of White Chicks is perhaps best measured by how frequently it continues to surface in online conversations, meme culture, and nostalgic retrospectives focused on early 2000s cinema. Quotes and scenes from the film circulate constantly across social media, often introducing the movie to viewers who were not even alive when it was originally released, which speaks to a kind of generational handoff that few comedies from that specific era have managed to achieve. This continued relevance is a testament to how well the film's humor has aged in certain respects, particularly its willingness to embrace absurdity without irony, a comedic sensibility that stands in contrast to some of the more self-aware comedic styles that have become common in more recent years. The film has also become a frequently cited example in broader conversations about disguised comedy as a genre, often mentioned alongside other films that use transformation and identity swapping as a central comedic device, and its specific approach to blending social commentary with pure physical comedy sets it apart within that broader category. Whether viewed today as a nostalgic favorite, a cult classic, or simply an example of fearless comedic filmmaking from a specific era, White Chicks remains a film that rewards deeper analysis far beyond its surface premise, revealing layers of social commentary, strong sibling chemistry, and genuinely committed comedic performances that continue to resonate with audiences discovering or rediscovering it today. White Chicks continues to hold a special place in the landscape of 2000s comedy. And beyond its plot there is an enormous amount to explore when it comes to the characters, the craft behind the film, and the cultural footprint it has left behind, all of which makes for a rich and rewarding deep dive for anyone revisiting this movie today. At the heart of the film are Kevin and Marcus Copeland, two brothers whose relationship forms the emotional backbone beneath all the outrageous comedy surrounding them. What makes their dynamic so compelling is the contrast in their personalities even before the disguised plot begins, with one brother often being portrayed as more impulsive and reckless in his approach to fieldwork, while the other tends to be the voice of caution, constantly trying to rein in his siblings' more chaotic instincts. This kind of brotherly push and pull is a classic device in buddy comedy storytelling, but the Wayans brothers bring an authenticity to it that comes from their real-life sibling relationship, and that lived-in chemistry translates into a believable bond on screen that elevates even the most absurd moments of the film. Their arc throughout the story follows a familiar but effective shape, beginning with two agents who are seen as failures or embarrassments within their own department, then forcing them into a situation so far outside their comfort zone that it strips away their professional armor entirely, and finally allowing them to rediscover their competence and value not despite the ridiculous disguise but almost because of it. Since the skills of observation, adaptability, and quick thinking that make them good federal agents are the very same skills that allow them to survive undercover in a world of Hampton's high society. Beyond the central brotherly relationship, the film functions as a satire of wealth and class, and this angle deserves much closer examination than it often receives in casual conversations about the movie. The Hampton setting is deliberately chosen as a symbol of old money exclusivity, a world defined by garden parties, extravagant fashion shows, and a social hierarchy built almost entirely on appearance and reputation rather than substance. By dropping two working-class black FBI agents into this environment disguised as wealthy white socialites, the film creates a satirical lens that exposes just how much of high society behavior is performance in the first place. The socialites that Kevin and Marcus interact with are often portrayed as shallow, image-obsessed, and disconnected from any kind of genuine human connection, which serves to highlight the emptiness beneath the glamour of that world. In a strange way, the two disguised agents end up being more emotionally honest and perceptive than the people around them who have spent their entire lives immersed in that culture, and this inversion is where much of the film's sharper commentary lives, tucked beneath the surface of what many viewers initially dismiss as pure slapstick. The film essentially argues that identity, especially within elite social circles, is often a costume already, and the literal disguise worn by the brothers becomes a heightened version of the metaphorical disguises that many of the socialite characters wear every single day. The comedic technique on display throughout the film is also worth breaking down in detail, since it draws from a very specific lineage of American sketch comedy that the Wayans family helped popularize through their earlier television work. The humor leans heavily on physical comedy, exaggerated reactions, and a willingness to commit fully to bits that other filmmakers might have pulled back on, and this fearless commitment is part of what has allowed the film to endure as a quotable favorite years after release. Scenes built around dance sequences, awkward romantic tension, and moments of nearly getting caught rely on perfect comedic timing from the two lead performers, who spend the majority of the film acting through heavy prosthetics and makeup, which is no small feat considering how much of comedic performance typically depends on facial expression and physical nuance. The fact that both performers manage to convey humor, panic, charm, and frustration convincingly while buried under layers of makeup design speaks to a level of comedic skill that is often underappreciated when critics discuss the film purely on the basis of its premise. There is also a strong improvisational energy running through many of the film's scenes, a hallmark of the Wayans family's comedic approach that traces back to their sketch television roots, giving certain interactions a loose and spontaneous feeling that adds to the sense of chaotic fun defining the film's tone from start to finish. No discussion of the film's comedic legacy would be complete without addressing Terry Crews's performance as Latrell Spencer, a character who has taken on a life far beyond the film itself in the years since its release. Latrell's larger-than-life personality, his over-the-top physicality, and his now iconic dance sequence set to a popular song of that era have become one of the most referenced and reshared moments from the entire movie across social media platforms. What makes this performance so effective is the total commitment Terry Crews brings to a character who could have easily felt like a one-note joke, yet instead becomes memorable precisely because of the fearless energy and charisma poured into every single scene he appears in. This performance helped launch a broader recognition of Terry Crews as a comedic talent capable of stealing scenes even in an ensemble filled with strong performers, and it foreshadowed the kind of larger-than-life comedic roles he would go on to take in future projects. The cultural staying power of this particular character and his most famous scene demonstrates how a single standout performance within a broader ensemble comedy can end up defining much of how a film is remembered by audiences long after its initial theatrical run has ended. Turning to the production and reception side of the story, it is worth expanding on how the film performed both critically and commercially, since the gap between those two reactions tells an interesting story about audience taste versus critical expectation at the time. Critics reviewing the film upon its release were often skeptical of the central premise, viewing the makeup transformation concept as a gimmick that could not sustain an entire feature-length runtime, and many reviews focused on the perceived thinness of the plot rather than engaging with the satire or the comedic performances happening within it. Audiences, however, responded very differently, embracing the film's willingness to be unapologetically silly while still finding genuine laughs in its most outrageous set pieces. And this disconnect between critical reception and audience enjoyment is a pattern that has repeated itself with several cult comedy classics over the decades. Word of mouth and repeat viewings, particularly among younger audiences and fans of physical comedy, helped the film build box office momentum that exceeded its production budget significantly, proving that critical consensus does not always predict which films will find lasting cultural relevance. Over time, as the film moved from theatrical release into heavy rotation on cable television and later into constant circulation through streaming platforms and social media clips, its reputation shifted considerably, with many former skeptics coming to appreciate the boldness of its comedic swings and the surprising amount of heart woven into its central brotherly relationship. The lasting cultural impact of White Chicks is perhaps best measured by how frequently it continues to surface in online conversations, meme culture, and nostalgic retrospectives focused on early 2000s cinema. Quotes and scenes from the film circulate constantly across social media, often introducing the movie to viewers who were not even alive when it was originally released, which speaks to a kind of generational handoff that few comedies from that specific era have managed to achieve. This continued relevance is a testament to how well the film's humor has aged in certain respects, particularly its willingness to embrace absurdity without irony, a comedic sensibility that stands in contrast to some of the more self-aware comedic styles that have become common in more recent years. The film has also become a frequently cited example in broader conversations about disguised comedy as a genre, often mentioned alongside other films that use transformation and identity swapping as a central comedic device, and its specific approach to blending social commentary with pure physical comedy sets it apart within that broader category. Whether viewed today as a nostalgic favorite, a cult classic, or simply an example of fearless comedic filmmaking from a specific era, White Chicks remains a film that rewards deeper analysis far beyond its surface premise, revealing layers of social commentary, strong sibling chemistry, and genuinely committed comedic performances that continue to resonate with audiences discovering or rediscovering it today. White Chicks brought together a group of performers whose personal backgrounds and career paths are just as interesting as the film itself, and looking closely at the lives of the actors involved reveals how varied their journeys to Hollywood really were, ranging from a lifelong show business family to a former NFL athlete to performers who built their careers through television before landing in this particular ensemble. Shawn Wayans, who plays Kevin Copeland in the film, was born Shawn Mathis Wayans on January 19, 1971, in New York City, the ninth of 10 children born to Howellstown Wayans, a supermarket manager, and Elvira Alethea Wayans, a homemaker and social worker. Shawn grew up in an apartment in Manhattan's Fulton Houses, a housing project in the Chelsea neighborhood, alongside several of his siblings who would go on to become fellow entertainers, and his family had once been Jehovah's Witnesses. By the time Shawn was coming of age, several of his older brothers and sisters were already finding their footing in comedy and entertainment, which meant he grew up immersed in a household where performing and writing comedy were part of everyday life. While attending Bayard Rustin High School for the Humanities, Shawn made his feature film debut with a minor role in I'm Gonna Get You Sucka, a film his older brother Keenan wrote, directed, and starred in, and which also featured Chris Rock and Isaac Hayes. He graduated from high school in 1989, and shortly after, in 1991, he joined the cast of In Living Color, the groundbreaking sketch comedy show created by his brother Keenan Ivory Wayans, initially appearing as the show's resident DJ before becoming a more featured performer alongside his siblings. That show, which ran from 1990 to 1994 on Fox, became a launching pad not only for the Wayans family but also for future stars like Jim Carrey and Jamie Foxx. Shawn then carved out his own path as a leading man opposite his younger brother Marlon in the WB sitcom The Wayans Brothers, which ran from 1995 to 1999 and followed two girl-crazy siblings living with their eccentric father, and this show cemented the on-screen partnership between the two brothers that would later carry over into their film careers. Through the 2000s, Shawn built a strong reputation in feature comedy, co-writing and starring in the Scary Movie franchise as Ray Wilkins, then joining Marlon for White Chicks in 2004, followed by Little Man in 2006 and Dance Flick in 2009, all of which he had a hand in writing or producing in addition to acting. Away from film, Sean also created Thugaboo, a series of children's television specials that began in 2006 and aimed to teach young viewers important life lessons through humor and music. In his personal life, Sean married his wife Ursula and the couple have 3 children together, 2 daughters and a son, and after stepping back from major screen roles for a stretch of years, it was announced that Sean would be returning for new projects tied to both the Scary Movie franchise and a White Chicks sequel. Marlon Wayans, who portrays Marcus Copeland, was born Marlon Lamont Wayans on July 23, 1972, in New York City, making him the youngest of the 10 Wayans siblings. Like his brother Sean, he grew up in New York City housing projects as the son of Howell Wayans, a supermarket manager, and Elvira Wayans, a homemaker and social worker, with his father being a devout Jehovah's Witness. Marlon attended the Fiorello H. LaGuardia High School of Music and Art and Performing Arts, a well-known institution for young performers in New York, and after graduating he enrolled at Howard University in Washington, D.C. However, with his siblings' entertainment careers already taking off, Marlon grew restless in his studies and left college after about 2 years to pursue acting and comedy full-time. His first credited film role came in 1988 in I'm Gonna Get You Sucker, though his career did not truly accelerate until the 1990s, when he appeared in M.O. Money and joined the cast of In Living Color, staying with the show until 1994. He then partnered with Sean on the Wayans brothers throughout the back half of the decade, and the 2 brothers became known as a duo capable of writing, producing, and starring in their own material. In the 2000s, Marlon's filmography expanded significantly, including a much more dramatic turn in Darren Aronofsky's Requiem for a Dream in 2000, a role that showed a very different side of his range compared to the broad comedy he was best known for, before he returned to comedic ensemble work with Scary Movie, White Chicks, Little Man, and Dance Flick. Across his career, Marlon has appeared in dozens of films that have collectively earned enormous box office totals worldwide, and he has continued working steadily in both film and television in the years since, including voice work, streaming projects, and his own semi-autobiographical sitcom later in his career. On a personal level, Marlon has been open in public interviews about his family life and has spoken candidly about supporting one of his children through their gender transition, using his platform to discuss identity and inclusion in ways that reflect a more personal and reflective side to a performer largely known for outsized comedic energy. Terry Crews, who plays the unforgettable Latrell Spencer, followed a path to Hollywood that looked almost nothing like the Wayans brothers' show business upbringing. He was born Terry Allen Crews on July 30, 1968, in Flint, Michigan, and by most accounts his childhood was shaped by a strict, difficult household and financial hardship. He attended Flint's Southwestern Academy and earned an Art Excellence Scholarship to study at the Interlochen Center for the Arts before enrolling at Western Michigan University, where he pursued a degree in art, while also becoming a standout member of the school's football team. Playing as a defensive end, Crews earned all-conference honors and was a key contributor to WMU's 1988 conference championship season. That success on the field led to his selection by the Los Angeles Rams in the 11th round of the 1991 NFL Draft, beginning a professional football career that would prove to be far less stable than his college success might have suggested. Crews played only a handful of games for the Rams before taking time away from the league, then returned in 1993 with a brief stint on the Green Bay Packers practice roster before moving on to the San Diego Chargers, where he appeared in 10 games that season. After another year away from American football, he traveled to Dusseldorf, Germany to play for the Rhein-Fire of the World League of American Football, a stint that was strong enough to earn him a one-year contract back in the NFL with the Washington franchise in 1995, before a final short stretch with the Philadelphia Eagles in 1996 brought his playing career to a close. Throughout these years of instability and frequent roster cuts, Crews leaned on his artistic talent to help support his young family, at one point working as a sketch artist and painting portraits of his football teammates to bring in extra income, and he even used his art background while still playing, producing a line of NFL-licensed lithographs. After retiring from football in the late 1990s, Cruise relocated to Los Angeles to pursue acting, landing an early role as the character T-Money on the American Gladiator-style series Battle Dome in 1999. His breakout film role came the following year in The Sixth Day, where he shared the screen with Arnold Schwarzenegger, and from there he built a run of memorable comedic film appearances including Friday After Next, The Longest Yard, Zoolander, and of course White Chicks. A performance that many fans consider one of the most quotable and rewatched moments of his early career thanks to his fearless physical comedy, and the now iconic dance sequence his character performs. Cruise went on to have significant television success as well, including a well-remembered recurring role on Arrested Development, a starring turn as the family patriarch on Everybody Hates Chris, and later one of his most beloved roles as Sergeant Terry Jeffords on Brooklyn Nine-Nine, in addition to hosting duties on America's Got Talent. On a personal note, Cruise has been married to his wife Rebecca since 1989, and the couple has 5 children together. He has also written a memoir discussing his upbringing, his struggles, and his path toward personal growth, and has become a public voice on topics related to healthy masculinity and recovery. Jamie King, who plays Heather Vandergeld, one of the wealthy sisters at the center of the story before the switch takes place, was born Jamie Barbara King on April 23, 1979. She built a career as both an actress and a model, and became especially well known in later years for her role in the television series Heart of Dixie, which ran from 2011 to 2015, as well as the post-apocalyptic drama Black Summer, which ran from 2019 to 2021. Before those roles, King had already built a solid film resume, having appeared in Pearl Harbor in 2001 and Slackers in 2002, before joining the cast of White Chicks in 2004, and she would go on to appear in the stylized comic book adaptation Sin City as well as several other studio productions over the years that followed, building a career that spans both prestige projects and mainstream comedy and action fare. Frankie Faison, who plays Section Chief Elliot Gordon, the frustrated superior overseeing Kevin and Marcus throughout the film, brought decades of seasoned acting experience to the production by the time White Chicks was made. Born Frankie Russell Faison on June 10, 1949, he built a career recognized for his role as Deputy Commissioner Irvin Burrell on the acclaimed HBO series The Wire, as well as his recurring appearances as Barney Matthews across the Hannibal Lecter film franchise. His long career in film and television gave the supporting cast of White Chicks a grounded, veteran presence, and he continued working steadily in the years following the film's release, including later roles in horror remakes and prestige streaming projects. Busy Phillips, credited as Elizabeth Jean Phillips and known professionally as Busy, plays Karen in the film. She was born on June 25, 1979, and built her career on beloved television roles, first gaining recognition on the cult favorite series Freaks and Geeks from 1999 to 2000, before joining the cast of Dawson's Creek as Audrey Liddell starting in 2001. She made her film debut in 2000 with The Smokers, followed by Homeroom in 2002, and then White Chicks in 2004, and continued building her filmography through the following decades with films like Maid of Honor and He's Just Not That Into You. In more recent years she has become known for hosting her own late-night talk show and for starring in the musical comedy series Girls 5 Eva. Lachlan Monroe, who plays Agent Jake Harper, is a Canadian actor born on February 12, 1966, whose notable film credits include A Night at the Roxbury in 1998 and the Scary Movie franchise beginning in 2000, giving him an established connection to the same comedic universe of parody films that the Wayans brothers had already built a reputation within before White Chicks brought him into their cast. John Hurd, who portrays Warren Vandergeld, the father of the socialite sisters in the film's central storyline, was a veteran character actor whose career spanned several decades of American film and television before his passing in 2017. His presence in the cast added a layer of seasoned dramatic weight to the film's ensemble of comedic performers, reflecting a career built largely around supporting roles in major studio productions across multiple genres. Jennifer Carpenter, who plays Lisa in the film, would go on to become widely recognized for her long-running role as Deborah Morgan on the acclaimed television series Dexter, a part that came to define much of her career in the years following White Chicks, and she later returned to that same character when the franchise revived the story in its Dexter, New Blood continuation. And Dudek, who plays Tiffany Wilson, one of the two socialite sisters whose safety sets the entire plot into motion, built a career largely centered on television work in the years following the film, including a later stint appearing in The Flash, contributing to a body of work defined by steady guests and recurring roles across network television. Maitland Ward, who plays Brittany Wilson, the other Wilson's sister at the heart of the story, had already built a following through earlier television work before appearing in White Chicks, and her career path in the years since the film took a very different direction from many of her co-stars, moving into an entirely separate industry later in her career. Taken together, the ensemble behind White Chicks represents a genuinely wide range of paths into Hollywood, from a tightly knit comedy dynasty that built its foundation through sketch television, to a former professional football player who reinvented himself entirely through sheer force of personality and physical comedy, to a group of supporting performers who came from teen dramas, established character acting careers, and modeling backgrounds before converging on this one particular film. That blend of backgrounds is part of what gave the movie its unique chemistry, since the cast brought entirely different comedic instincts, life experiences, and performance styles to the same set, resulting in an ensemble energy that has helped the film remain a memorable and frequently revisited piece of 2000s comedy nearly 2 decades after its original release. White Chicks stands out not just for what audiences see on screen but for the sheer scale of behind-the-scenes work that made its central comedic premise possible. And digging into the production side of the film reveals just how much genuine difficulty, absurdity, and unintentional comedy emerged from the process of turning two grown men into convincing high-society women for an entire feature film shoot. The film was produced on a budget of approximately $37 million, a moderate figure for a studio comedy of its era, but one that had to stretch across an unusually complicated production challenge. Since a huge portion of that budget and the daily shooting schedule was consumed not by elaborate sets or big action sequences but by the makeup process required to transform Sean and Marlon Wayans into their characters Tiffany and Brittany Wilson. Despite this added complexity, the film went on to gross over $113 million worldwide, meaning it earned back roughly 3 times its production budget. A strong return that made it one of the more profitable studio comedies of that summer season, even though a significant chunk of the budget had to be funneled into a level of practical special effects work more commonly associated with fantasy or horror films than mainstream comedy. At the center of the production's biggest logistical challenge was the transformation sequence itself, which required Sean and Marlon to sit through hours of prosthetic application every single day before filming could even begin. According to Marlon, it took nearly 7 hours for the two brothers to get through hair and makeup each day while filming the comedy, a process so exhausting that he later described it by saying it almost killed them. This was not a one-time transformation captured in a single dramatic reveal shot. It was a grueling daily routine that the brothers had to repeat over and over across the majority of principal photography, and the sheer repetition of that process became one of the most demanding aspects of making the film, turning what audiences experience as a fast, funny visual gag into a genuine feat of endurance for the two lead performers. The makeup itself was created by veteran makeup effects artist Greg Kinnear, who worked with his team for months developing the right facial and body prosthetics for Sean and Marlon before filming even started, using foam and latex to restructure the shape of the actors' jaws and noses, along with specially designed contact lenses to change the appearance of their eyes. Kinnear explained that the secret to making the illusion work was actually the top lip of each brother, since the only part of their faces that was not covered by a prosthetic appliance was their lower lip, which meant nearly every other visible feature had to be reconstructed and blended convincingly enough to hold up under bright studio lighting and close-up camera angles. To complete the illusion, each brother also had to wear specially designed wigs that were built to cover the entire side of their heads and hide the edges of the prosthetic work, and Marlon later admitted in interviews that the whole process was simply difficult from start to finish. This meant that even something as small as adjusting a wig or checking a mirror on set required careful coordination with the makeup team to avoid disturbing the prosthetic work that had taken hours to apply that morning. Kinnear later revealed that the production spent a total of 60 days shooting with the brothers in full prosthetic makeup, a stretch of filming that he described as grueling not only for the actors wearing the appliances but also for his own team, who had to recreate the exact same look with total precision every single day. He explained that the tolerances involved were incredibly tight, noting that if a single piece of foam ended up 1/8 of an inch off center from where it needed to be, it would throw off the entire look of the face, meaning the margin for error during each morning's application process was razor thin. This kind of precision demand turned the makeup trailer into one of the most high-pressure environments on the entire production, since a small mistake early in the morning could cascade into visible inconsistencies on camera later in the day, forcing reshoots or awkward angle adjustments to hide flaws that a rushed application might introduce. Perhaps one of the most amusing production details to come out of the process was just how disruptive something as simple as eating or drinking became once the actors were in full prosthetic makeup. Kinnear noted that if Sean or Marlon ate or drank anything during the shooting day, they would need to be touched up afterward, since the movement of their mouths while chewing or the moisture from a drink could shift or loosen the delicate prosthetic pieces around their lips and jawline. This meant that something as mundane as a lunch break on set became a logistical event requiring careful planning, since the brothers essentially had to treat mealtimes as a mini version of the makeup process all over again, with touch-up artists standing by to fix any smudging or lifting around the edges of the appliances before the cameras could roll again. It is easy to imagine the kind of on-set humor this situation created, with two grown men having to sip drinks through straws with exaggerated care or eat in tiny careful bites while surrounded by a small army of makeup artists hovering nearby ready to intervene at the first sign of a slipping prosthetic. All while everyone on set understood the absurdity of the situation given that the entire premise of the film they were making was already built around outrageous physical comedy. Beyond the prosthetics themselves, the costume design added another layer of detail to the production, since the wardrobe team built an entire visual identity around early 2000s high society fashion in order to sell the illusion of wealth and status that the Wilson sisters were meant to represent. The costuming leaned into recognizable luxury and status symbol fashion trends of that specific period, dressing the disguised brothers in outfits designed to reflect the kind of exclusive, trend-driven wardrobe that wealthy socialites of that era might have worn to exclusive Hamptons events, which meant the costume department had to think not just about comedy but about believability, ensuring that from a distance, or in a crowd scene, the silhouette and styling read convincingly as high society fashion rather than costume for its own sake. This attention to authentic styling served the satirical edge of the film, since part of the joke depended on the disguises being just convincing enough to fool the socialite characters around them, meaning the costume and hair team had to walk a fine line between comedic exaggeration and genuine believability throughout the shoot. The production also involved considerable choreography work, since several key sequences in the film required the disguised brothers to participate in dance numbers and social events where believable movement was just as important as the visual disguise itself. Tina Landon served as the film's choreographer, tasked with designing movement sequences that the actors could perform convincingly while wearing heavy prosthetics and restrictive costuming, a challenge that added yet another layer of physical difficulty on top of everything else the cast had to manage during filming. Dancing convincingly while wearing facial prosthetics that could shift with too much movement, combined with costuming and wigs that had to stay in place under physical exertion, meant that even scenes designed purely for entertainment value carried real technical risk behind the camera. And the now famous dance sequence involving Terry Crews's character required its own careful blocking and rehearsal to land both as a stand-alone comedic showcase and as a believable moment within the story. Animal performers and animatronics also played a surprisingly significant role in the production. The crew built animatronic effects for both a Rottweiler and a Pomeranian used in the film, requiring a dedicated animatronic designer and fabricator to construct convincing mechanical versions of these animals for specific shots that would have been difficult or unsafe to capture using live animals alone. This kind of practical animatronic work was fairly ambitious for a mainstream studio comedy, and it reflects just how much technical planning went into even the smaller comedic beats scattered throughout the film, since audiences watching these scenes likely had no idea that some of the animal moments they were laughing at required the same kind of specialized effects work typically reserved for far more effects-heavy productions. The sheer scale of the makeup and effects team assembled for the production also speaks to how seriously the studio treated the technical challenge of the film's central premise. Alongside Greg Kinnear as makeup effects designer, the production brought on additional makeup effects designers, prosthetic makeup artists, and multiple special effects makeup artists, along with a dedicated visual effects team spread across several different effects houses handling compositing, coordination, and digital cleanup work. This meant that the transformation audiences see on screen was not the product of a single artist working alone but rather an entire specialized department, coordinated across practical prosthetic work, digital touch-ups, and traditional makeup application, all working together to maintain a consistent and convincing look across dozens of shooting days and countless individual takes. Given everything the cast had to endure physically during the shoot, from the exhausting hours in the makeup chair each morning to the careful choreography and the constant risk of prosthetic slippage during physical comedy sequences, it is easy to understand why so much of the humor that emerged behind the scenes came from the sheer absurdity of the situation the actors found themselves in every single day. Two accomplished comedic performers, already known for their sketch comedy backgrounds and quick improvisational instincts, spending 7 hours a day being turned into entirely different people before they could even begin the actual job of acting, then having to maintain that disguise through long, physically demanding shooting days, created a working environment that was inherently funny even before a single scene was filmed. The production itself became a kind of extended comedic performance in its own right, with the technical crew and the actors bound together by the shared absurdity of what they were attempting to pull off. And that sense of shared commitment to a genuinely ridiculous premise is part of what gave the finished film its distinctive energy. Since audiences can often sense when a cast and crew were fully invested in selling a joke rather than simply going through the motions. Looking back at the production nearly 2 decades later, the achievement of White Chicks becomes even more impressive when measured against the technical standards of its time. Prosthetic makeup work of this scale and duration, sustained across 60 full shooting days, represented a significant undertaking for a studio comedy in 2004, a genre that rarely receives the same level of technical investment typically reserved for science fiction or horror productions. The fact that Sean and Marlon Wayans were willing to endure such a physically demanding process, day after day, in service of a broad comedic premise says a great deal about their commitment to the material and their trust in the vision that their brother Keenan Ivory Wayans had for the film as director. That level of dedication, paired with a skilled and clearly overworked effects team led by Greg Kinnear, is ultimately what allowed the film's central gimmick to actually work on screen, turning what could have been a flimsy, unconvincing disguise into something audiences were willing to accept for an entire feature-length runtime. Laughing along with the premise rather than being pulled out of the story by an unconvincing transformation. If diving into the real production challenges and behind-the-scenes effort behind White Chicks gave you a new appreciation for everything that went into making this comedy classic, do not forget to like this video, share it with fellow fans of the movie, and subscribe to the channel for more detailed breakdowns of your favorite Hollywood films and the incredible work that goes on behind the camera. White Chicks arrived in theaters in the summer of 2004 at a particularly interesting moment in American comedy history, a period when studio comedies were increasingly willing to lean into high-concept premises, broad physical transformation gags, and ensemble-driven humor built around recognizable comedic personalities rather than tightly plotted farce. To understand the cultural context surrounding the film, it helps to look at what the American comedy landscape looked like in the years leading up to its release. The early 2000s had already seen a wave of gross-out and high-concept comedies achieve massive box office success, a trend that had been building since the late 90s with films that leaned heavily into shock value, physical exaggeration, and premises built around characters pretending to be something they were not. Against this backdrop, White Chicks fit comfortably within a broader trend of Hollywood studios greenlighting increasingly audacious comedic concepts, banking on the idea that audiences of that era were hungry for something bold and unafraid to commit fully to its premise rather than something safe or predictable. The film also arrived at a moment when the Wayans family had already established themselves as one of the most influential comedic dynasties in American entertainment, building on a legacy that stretched back to the late 80s and early 90s with projects that helped define an entire era of black comedy on television and in film. Their earlier work on sketch comedy television had already demonstrated a willingness to tackle social commentary through exaggerated parody, often using humor as a vehicle to comment on issues of race, class, and identity in ways that mainstream comedy at the time rarely attempted. White Chicks continued this tradition by taking the disguised comedy format, a genre with a long history in American film and television, and using it as a vehicle to explore questions about class privilege and social performance within elite white society, filtered through the specific lens of two black FBI agents navigating a world that was entirely unfamiliar and, in many ways, culturally coded as being closed off to people who did not fit a very narrow definition of belonging. One of the most significant cultural conversations surrounding the film, both at the time of its release and in the years since, has centered on questions of race, makeup, and the history of racial impersonation in American entertainment. Because the film's premise involves two black actors using extensive prosthetic makeup to portray white characters, some critics and commentators have drawn comparisons to the long and troubled history of performers using makeup to portray other races on screen, a history that in America is most strongly associated with the deeply harmful legacy of blackface minstrelsy. It is worth noting, however, that many defenders of the film and much of its audience have pushed back against the direct equivalency, pointing out that the film's premise operates in the opposite direction of that historical practice, using the disguise as a vehicle for satire aimed at the socialite class rather than at any particular racial group, and that the humor is built around exposing the emptiness and performative nature of upper-class white social behavior rather than mocking whiteness itself as an identity. This tension between different readings of the film's central premise has made it a frequently cited example in broader academic and pop culture discussions about the history of racial disguise in American comedy, and the film continues to generate genuinely mixed reactions depending on how individual viewers interpret its intent, its execution, and its place within a much longer tradition of disguise-based comedy that includes films built around characters crossing lines of gender, class, age, and other forms of identity for comedic effect. Beyond the racial dimension of its premise, the film also engages, whether intentionally or as a byproduct of its comedic setup, with questions about gender performance, since the two lead characters are not simply disguised as different individuals but are specifically disguised as women, requiring the actors to adopt mannerisms, voice patterns, movement styles, and social behaviors coded as feminine within the specific context of wealthy socialite culture. This adds another layer to the film's exploration of identity as performance, since the characters are essentially navigating two simultaneous disguises, one of race and one of gender, and the comedy often derives from the friction between their own instincts and the exaggerated version of femininity they must perform to maintain the illusion. Some cultural critics have noted that this kind of gender disguise comedy has a long history in American film dating back decades, with several major studio comedies built around male characters dressing as women for practical or comedic reasons. And White Chicks sits within that broader lineage while adding the additional layer of racial disguise that distinguishes it from most other entries in that particular comedic subgenre. The class satire embedded within the film's premise also deserves attention as a significant cultural element of the story, since the film uses its Hampton setting and its cast of wealthy socialite characters to poke fun at a very specific type of American privilege that had become increasingly visible in mainstream culture during the early 2000s. A period that saw growing media fascination with reality television, tabloid culture, and the lifestyles of the ultra-wealthy. The socialite characters in the film, obsessed with appearance, status, and social hierarchy, reflect a broader cultural moment when American audiences were becoming increasingly aware of and fascinated by the excesses of wealthy elite social circles, a fascination that would only grow throughout the following decade as reality television built entire programming blocks around wealthy families and socialite culture. In this sense, White Chicks can be read as an early example of mainstream comedy engaging with themes that would become even more culturally relevant in the years following its release, positioning the film as something of a time capsule that captured a specific moment of growing public interest in and skepticism toward the lives of the extremely wealthy. The film's reception at the time of its release also reflects broader patterns in how comedy films, particularly those centered on black creators and performers, were often evaluated by mainstream critics during that era. Despite the film's commercial success and its eventual status as a beloved cult favorite, initial critical reviews were largely dismissive, often failing to engage seriously with the satirical elements embedded within the story and instead focusing narrowly on the surface-level absurdity of the makeup-driven premise. This pattern of critical dismissal followed by long-term audience embrace and cultural reevaluation is not unique to White Chicks, but it does reflect a broader historical trend in which comedies created by and starring black performers have often faced a steeper climb toward critical respectability compared to similarly structured comedies from other creators, only to be reassessed more favorably years later once their cultural impact and staying power became undeniable. This dynamic makes White Chicks an interesting case study in how critical consensus and audience affection can diverge sharply upon a film's initial release, only to gradually realign as a film accumulates cultural relevance through repeated viewings, nostalgia, and online cultural discourse. The film's afterlife in internet and meme culture represents perhaps its most significant and unexpected cultural legacy, since the rise of social media platforms in the years following its release created an entirely new avenue through which the film could reach and resonate with audiences who may never have watched it in its original theatrical run. Specific lines of dialogue, character reactions, and comedic set pieces from the film have circulated widely across various social media platforms for years, often detached entirely from their original theatrical context and instead functioning as standalone units of humor that new generations discover and share independently of the film itself. This phenomenon reflects a broader shift in how comedic films from the early 2000s have found extended cultural relevance well beyond their theatrical windows, with certain scenes and quotes taking on a life of their own within internet culture in ways that filmmakers of that era could not have anticipated or planned for during the original production and marketing of the film. Terry Crews's memorable dance sequence in particular has become one of the most widely circulated and referenced moments from the entire film, frequently resurfacing in compilation videos, reaction content, and nostalgic retrospectives focused on beloved comedic moments from 2000 cinema. And this continued circulation has helped introduce the film to viewers who were far too young to have seen it during its original theatrical release. The film also holds a specific place within the broader historical context of the Wayans family's ongoing contribution to American comedy, representing one of the clearest examples of how the family successfully transitioned from television-based sketch comedy into feature film production, while maintaining the same willingness to tackle bold, high-concept premises that had defined their earlier television work. Coming several years after the family's massive success with the Scary Movie franchise, White Chicks demonstrated that the family's comedic sensibility could extend beyond genre parody into original high-concept storytelling, further cementing their status as one of the most consistently successful comedic filmmaking families in Hollywood history. This continuity between projects also reflects a broader historical pattern in American comedy filmmaking, where successful comedic voices are often given increasing creative latitude to pursue increasingly ambitious or unconventional premises once they have proven their ability to deliver commercially successful projects. And White Chicks stands as a clear example of a comedic family using that earned creative capital to pursue one of the more audacious comedic concepts of its era. Looking at the film through a wider historical lens, White Chicks also reflects broader shifts happening within American film culture regarding practical effects and prosthetic makeup technology during the early 2000s. A period that sat at an interesting crossroads between the era of purely practical effects work and the increasing availability of digital tools for compositing and touch-up work. The extensive use of practical prosthetic makeup in the film, rather than relying on digital effects to achieve the transformation, situates the movie within a specific technological moment in film history when practical effects artists were still considered the primary tool for achieving this kind of dramatic physical transformation on screen. Even as digital technology was beginning to change how filmmakers approached other aspects of visual storytelling. This choice to rely primarily on practical prosthetic work rather than digital manipulation has actually contributed to the film's lasting visual credibility, since practical effects from this era have often aged more gracefully than early digital effects work from the same period, giving the film's central transformation gag a tactile, physically grounded quality that continues to hold up reasonably well even when viewed by modern audiences accustomed to far more advanced digital effects. Technology. Taken together, The cultural and historical dimensions surrounding White Chicks reveal a film that is far more layered and complex than its reputation as a broad, silly studio comedy might initially suggest. From its engagement with sensitive questions about racial and gender disguise, to its satirical commentary on wealth and class privilege during a specific cultural moment of growing fascination with socialite culture, to its unexpected second life within internet and meme culture decades after its original release. The film continues to generate genuine cultural conversation and reinterpretation in ways that few comedies from its specific era have managed to sustain. Its place within the broader historical arc of the Wayans family's contribution to American comedy, combined with its position at an interesting technological crossroads in the history of practical effects filmmaking, further cements its status as a film worth examining not just as a source of laughs but as a genuine cultural artifact that captured and commented on a very specific moment in American entertainment history. If exploring the deeper cultural and historical context behind White Chicks gave you a new perspective on this film, do not forget to like this video, share it with fellow. White Chicks holds a fascinating position in film history as a movie whose iconic status was built almost entirely after the fact, through years of cultural accumulation rather than through immediate critical recognition, and looking closely at the historical markers surrounding the film reveals just how unusual its journey toward classic status has actually been. At the time of its original release, White Chicks did not receive the kind of institutional recognition that typically accompanies a film later regarded as iconic. Rather than collecting acclaim from major critics groups, the film was instead nominated for 5 Golden Raspberry Awards, the annual ceremony that recognizes what its voters consider the worst achievements in film from the previous year, including a nomination in the Worst Picture category. This is a genuinely remarkable detail when placed alongside everything the film would go on to become culturally, since very few movies nominated for that particular dishonor go on to be remembered fondly decades later, let alone achieve the kind of enduring quotability and cult adoration that White Chicks has enjoyed. The film's Razzie nominations represent one of the more ironic historical footnotes in its story, a snapshot of exactly how misjudged its long-term cultural value was by contemporary awards voters focused narrowly on production polish and critical prestige rather than long-term audience connection and rewatch value. Fandom. That gap between institutional dismissal and genuine popular embrace is itself one of the most historically interesting aspects of the film's legacy, and it places White Chicks within a specific and recognizable category of comedy films that were savaged upon release only to be rediscovered and reclaimed by audiences over the following decade. This pattern of critical rejection followed by cult rehabilitation has become one of the defining historical narratives associated with the movie, frequently referenced whenever the film is discussed in retrospective pieces, anniversary articles, or nostalgic online conversations. The fact that a film nominated for some of the industry's most public dishonors could go on to become one of the most quoted and referenced studio comedies of its entire decade speaks to a very particular kind of historical vindication that few films ever experience. And it has become a central part of how fans and commentators frame the movie's overall story whenever its 20th anniversary or other retrospective milestones are marked. The film's 20th anniversary, which fell in the summer of 2024, became a notable cultural moment in its own right, with fans across social media and online community spaces marking the occasion with retrospective posts, nostalgic reflections, and renewed appreciation threads celebrating just how much staying power the film had demonstrated in the 2 decades since its original theatrical release. Online communities specifically organized discussion threads dedicated to commemorating the anniversary, treating it as a genuine cultural touchstone worth collectively acknowledging rather than letting the date pass unnoticed. This kind of organic, fan-driven anniversary recognition is itself a meaningful historical indicator, since films rarely receive this kind of spontaneous collective celebration from online communities unless they have achieved a level of shared cultural memory that transcends their original box office performance or critical reception. The willingness of an entire generation of Internet users to mark this specific anniversary date reflects just how deeply embedded certain scenes, lines, and moments from the film have become within broader shared cultural reference points, particularly among people who came of age watching the film on cable reruns or discovering it through clips and quotes, circulating online long after its theatrical run had ended. Reset era. Another iconic historical marker tied to the film involves its lasting association with the broader Wayans family filmography, since White Chicks arrived at a specific moment when the family was actively building one of the most commercially successful comedic runs in Hollywood history, following closely on the heels of their massive success with the Scary Movie franchise earlier in the decade. Positioned within that broader career timeline, White Chicks represents a pivotal moment in the family's evolution as filmmakers, marking their transition from parody-based comedy built around lampooning existing horror films into original high-concept comedic storytelling built entirely around their own premise rather than referencing or spoofing other existing properties. This shift in creative direction is an important historical detail for understanding the film's place within the larger arc of the Wayans family's contributions to American comedy, since it demonstrated their ability to generate box office success without leaning on parody as a creative crutch, a transition that would go on to influence the kinds of original comedic projects they pursued in the years that followed. The film's continued relevance has also been reinforced through persistent and highly publicized conversations about a potential sequel, conversations that have become something of an ongoing historical thread in entertainment news coverage over the years since the original film's release. Sean and Marlon Wayans have repeatedly discussed their own desire to revisit the characters of Kevin and Marcus Copeland in interviews spanning many years, and this sustained public interest in continuing the story has itself become part of the film's broader cultural narrative, reflecting just how much ongoing goodwill and curiosity still surrounds the original film nearly 2 decades after its release. The fact that a sequel has remained a persistent topic of conversation for so many years, without ever quite materializing, has almost become its own piece of pop culture folklore surrounding the franchise, regularly resurfacing whenever the brothers make public appearances or give interviews touching on their earlier work together. From a broader historical perspective within the disguised comedy genre, White Chicks also occupies a notable position as one of the more technically ambitious entries in a long lineage of Hollywood films built around characters using elaborate physical transformation for comedic effect. Its reliance on extensive practical prosthetic makeup, sustained across dozens of shooting days, places it within a specific technical tradition of transformation comedy that traces back through decades of Hollywood filmmaking. And its particular combination of racial and gender disguise makes it a frequently cited reference point whenever film historians or cultural critics discuss the broader evolution of disguise-based comedy as a distinct genre within American cinema. This technical ambition, combined with the social commentary embedded in its premise, has helped the film maintain relevance in academic and critical discussions of comedy filmmaking long after many of its contemporaries from the same era have faded from cultural memory. Ultimately, the historical arc of White Chicks tells a story of a film that was fundamentally misjudged by the critical and awards infrastructure of its own era, only to steadily accumulate genuine cultural significance through the far more democratic process of sustained audience affection, internet virality, and generational rediscovery. Few films manage to transform a Golden Raspberry nomination into genuine cult classic status over the following decades, and that unlikely trajectory remains one of the most fascinating and frequently discussed aspects of the film's entire legacy. Whether measured through anniversary celebrations, persistence equals speculation, or its continued circulation within internet meme culture, White Chicks stands as a compelling historical case study in how a film's true cultural value is sometimes only revealed with the passage of time, long after the initial wave of critical judgment has come and gone. If exploring these deeper historical milestones behind White Chicks gave you a new appreciation for the unlikely journey this film has taken to become a beloved cult classic, do not forget to like this video, share it with fellow fans of the movie, and subscribe to the channel for more detailed breakdowns of your favorite Hollywood films and the surprising histories behind them. White Chicks is, in many respects, one of the more quietly ironic films to emerge from American studio comedy in the 2000s, not because of any single joke buried within its screenplay, but because of how many layers of genuine irony surround the film itself, its production, its reception, and its long-term legacy. Looking closely at these ironies reveals a movie whose real-world story often mirrors, and sometimes directly inverts, the very themes it set out to explore on screen, creating a strange and fascinating feedback loop between the film's content and the circumstances surrounding its creation and reception. Perhaps the most immediately obvious irony surrounding the film is the enormous gap between its critical reception at the time of release and the cultural stature it has since achieved. A movie that was nominated for multiple Golden Raspberry Awards, an honor specifically designed to call out what voters consider the worst filmmaking achievements of a given year, has gone on to become one of the most quoted, referenced, and beloved studio comedies of its entire decade. There is a deep irony in the fact that an institution built around publicly shaming perceived failures in film ended up essentially predicting nothing about how audiences would actually feel about this particular movie over the following 20 years. The very awards body that singled the film out as an example of poor filmmaking has, in a sense, been proven wrong by the passage of time, since few films nominated for Worst Picture in any given year go on to enjoy the kind of sustained cultural relevance, meme status, and generational rediscovery that White Chicks has experienced. This irony becomes even sharper when you consider that the film's commercial success at the box office, earning roughly 3 times its production budget, already demonstrated at the time of release that audiences were responding to something the critical establishment was either missing or actively dismissing, meaning the disconnect between professional critical judgment and genuine audience enjoyment was visible immediately, even before the benefit of hindsight made that disconnect impossible to ignore. Another rich vein of irony runs through the film's central premise itself, since the entire plot depends on 2 FBI agents becoming so convincing in their disguises that nobody around them can tell they are not who they claim to be, and yet the real-world production process required to achieve that fictional believability was, by all accounts, anything but effortless or convincing behind the scenes. The characters within the story are meant to pull off their transformation with relative ease once the disguise is applied, moving confidently through high society events without drawing suspicion, but the actual actors playing those characters spent hours each morning in a grueling, physically uncomfortable process just to achieve that same illusion. And even then had to be constantly monitored and touched up throughout the day to maintain consistency. There is something quietly funny and ironic about a film whose entire comedic engine runs on the idea of effortless deception when the making of that illusion was, in reality, one of the most labor-intensive and logistically demanding production challenges of any studio comedy from that era. The fictional ease of the disguise stands in direct contrast to the very real difficulty of constructing it, and that contrast between on-screen simplicity and off-screen complexity is itself a kind of irony baked into the DNA of the entire production. There is also a compelling irony embedded in the film's approach to social class and privilege, since a story built around exposing the shallow, performative nature of wealthy socialite culture required an enormous amount of genuine studio wealth and resources to actually produce convincingly. The film spends its runtime satirizing a world obsessed with appearances, status symbols, and the maintenance of a flawless public image, while the production itself poured significant financial and technical resources into maintaining a flawless, seamless illusion of its own, spending large portions of its budget ensuring that its central visual deception looked polished and convincing enough to sustain an entire feature-length runtime. In other words, a movie mocking a culture obsessed with surface-level perfection was, behind the scenes, deeply invested in achieving its own kind of surface-level perfection, requiring meticulous daily maintenance to avoid so much as a single visible flaw in the illusion it was presenting to audiences. This parallel between the satirized subject and the film's own production values adds a layer of self-reflexive irony that many casual viewers likely never consciously notice, even though it sits at the very heart of how the movie was made. The casting and career trajectories of several cast members add further ironic dimension to the film's legacy, particularly when it comes to Terry Crews, whose performance as Latrell Spencer has become one of the most iconic and widely referenced moments in the entire movie. There is a genuine irony in the fact that a performer who spent years struggling through an unstable and frequently interrupted professional football career, being cut, picked up, and cut again by multiple teams across different leagues, would go on to find his most enduring and beloved piece of pop culture recognition not through physical athletic dominance but through a comedic dance sequence built around vulnerability, exaggerated charm, and willingness to look completely ridiculous on screen. The very qualities that may have made him stand out as an intimidating physical presence on a football field were repurposed, almost inverted, into a comedic performance defined by softness, romantic desperation, and joyful absurdity. And that inversion between his earlier professional identity and his breakout comedic persona represents one of the more quietly touching ironies tied to any individual cast member's personal history intersecting with this particular film. There is also an interesting irony in how the film's premise, built around agents who are constantly getting in trouble for being too unconventional or too willing to bend the rules within their own department, ultimately requires those same agents to become masters of an entirely different kind of rule-following once they are undercover, needing to strictly adhere to an elaborate set of social customs, mannerisms, and unspoken hierarchies within Hampton's high society in order to avoid blowing their cover. The characters who begin the film as chronic rule breakers within their professional environment are forced to become hyper-vigilant rule followers within an entirely different social environment, and their success in the story ultimately depends on their ability to master a rigid, unfamiliar code of conduct that is, in many ways, far more restrictive and demanding than anything required of them within their actual jobs as federal agents. This inversion, where characters defined by their inability to conform are forced into an environment requiring extreme conformity in order to survive, sits at the emotional and comedic core of the entire story, and it represents a kind of structural irony that gives the film more narrative coherence than its broad comedic reputation might initially suggest. The disguise itself carries a further layer of irony worth exploring in depth, since the entire justification for Kevin and Marcus adopting their elaborate transformation stems from a very practical, almost mundane bureaucratic problem, namely the fear of losing their jobs after yet another failed assignment, rather than any grand heroic motivation. The characters do not choose to undergo an extraordinarily difficult and physically demanding disguise because of some noble calling or deep personal conviction. They do it primarily out of self-preservation and professional desperation, wanting to avoid the embarrassment and consequence of yet another failure. There is something ironic about the fact that such an enormous, elaborate, and ultimately consequential transformation, one that leads them to expose a genuine criminal conspiracy and save lives, originates from such a small and self-interested motivation. The scale of the disguise and its eventual heroic outcome stand in ironic contrast to the modest, almost petty bureaucratic anxiety that set the entire chain of events into motion in the first place, reminding viewers that some of the most consequential outcomes in both fiction and real life can emerge from surprisingly unglamorous and self-serving starting points. Another layer of irony surrounds the emotional authenticity that develops within the story despite, or perhaps because of, the elaborate deception at its center. As Kevin and Marcus spend more time undercover, they begin forming genuine emotional connections with the people around them, connections built on real conversations, real vulnerability, and real personal chemistry, even though every one of those interactions is technically happening under false pretenses regarding their identity. There is a rich irony in the idea that some of the most emotionally honest moments in the entire film occur precisely when the characters are being the most literally dishonest about who they are, suggesting that authenticity in human connection may have less to do with the surface-level facts of identity and more to do with the sincerity of the emotional exchange happening underneath whatever disguise, literal or figurative, a person might be wearing at any given moment. This thematic irony, buried within a movie primarily remembered for its broad slapstick humor, gives the story an unexpected emotional undercurrent that elevates it slightly beyond pure gimmick comedy, even if that deeper thematic resonance is rarely the first thing audiences discuss when reminiscing about the film. The film's marketing and box office performance also contain a notable ironic dimension, since a movie built around the idea of successfully fooling an entire community of socially sophisticated, image-obsessed characters into believing a completely implausible disguise was itself banking on convincing a mainstream movie-going audience to buy into that same implausible premise for an entire feature-length runtime. In a strange way, the commercial success of the film represents the audience itself falling for the same kind of suspension of disbelief that the socialite characters within the story fall for, willingly accepting an outlandish visual deception in exchange for genuine entertainment value, mirroring the very dynamic the film depicts on screen. This meta-layer of irony, where the audience's willingness to accept the premise mirrors the fictional character's willingness to accept the disguise, adds an additional wrinkle to how the film's relationship with its own audience can be understood, blurring the line between the deception happening within the story and the willing suspension of disbelief happening in movie theaters showing that story to paying audiences. There is also irony to be found in how the film has aged and been reinterpreted by different audiences over time, particularly regarding its handling of race, gender, and social commentary. A film that faced immediate dismissal from many critics upon release, some of whom viewed its central gimmick as shallow or gimmicky without engaging deeply with its satirical intent, has since become a frequent subject of much more serious academic and cultural analysis, with scholars and critics revisiting the film specifically to unpack its handling of racial disguise, gender performance, and class satire. A movie initially treated by much of the critical establishment as unworthy of serious analysis has, ironically, become exactly the kind of film that invites serious analysis, generating think pieces, academic discussion, and retrospective cultural criticism that far exceeds the level of engagement it received during its original theatrical run. The very dismissal that the film faced upon release has, in an odd way, become part of what makes its later reconsideration so notable, since revisiting a film that was so thoroughly written off by contemporary critics carries its own built-in narrative of vindication and rediscovery that adds interest to any later critical engagement with the material. The persistent conversations around a potential sequel carry their own ironic weight as well, since a franchise that could easily capitalize on decades of accumulated nostalgia and cultural relevance has remained, for years, stuck in a state of permanent almost happening, discussed repeatedly in interviews without ever actually materializing into a finished project. There is irony in the fact that a film so frequently cited as a beloved cult classic, one that clearly retains enormous audience goodwill and continued cultural relevance, has not yet been followed by an official continuation, even as far less beloved or culturally resonant properties from the same era have received multiple sequels, reboots, or continuations. The persistent public desire for more of these characters, paired with the persistent absence of any actual follow-up, creates its own strange ongoing irony that fans of the film have had to sit with for the better part of 2 decades, watching countless other franchises expand and continue while this particular story has remained frozen exactly where it left off in 2004. Finally, there is a broader, almost philosophical irony that sits at the heart of the entire white chicks phenomenon, tying together many of these smaller ironies into a single overarching observation about the nature of comedy and cultural value. A film originally judged primarily on the surface-level absurdity of its premise, dismissed by many critics as a shallow gimmick unworthy of serious consideration, ultimately proved to have far more staying power, cultural relevance, and thematic depth than a large portion of its initial critical reception gave it credit for. The film essentially disguised genuine social commentary, emotional sincerity, and structural narrative craftsmanship beneath a premise that many observers were too quick to judge based on its surface-level absurdity alone, meaning the very act of underestimating white chicks based on its cover mirrors, in a strange and fitting way, exactly the kind of surface-level judgment that the film itself satirizes through its socialite characters, who are constantly shown valuing appearance and image over genuine substance. In this sense, the most fitting irony of all may be that a film about the dangers of judging people entirely by their surface appearance was itself judged almost entirely by its surface appearance upon release, only to have its true value gradually recognized once audiences and critics alike were willing to look past the initial premise and engage with everything the film was actually doing underneath its elaborate, unforgettable disguise. If uncovering these layers of irony behind white chicks gave you a new way of thinking about this film and everything that went into making it, do not forget to like this video, share it with fellow fans of the movie, and subscribe to the channel for more detailed breakdowns of your favorite Hollywood films and the surprising stories hidden beneath their surface. Fans of the movie, and subscribe to the channel for more detailed breakdowns of your favorite Hollywood films and the cultural conversations they continue to spark.